Alrighty.
All right, you should be recording.
Okay, super. Thank you. Okay, so in the way of sort of a high-level overview of the project, for those of you who are familiar with sort of the Massachusetts state approach to climate resiliency at the local level, there's a two-part grant program. There are planning grants, which are available. Plympton has already been the recipient of one of those and actually developed a climate resiliency plan as part of that. And then once you've done that, that opens the gates, if you will, to the availability of what are known as action grants. And so this work that we're talking about tonight is being carried out through one of those action grants. And it was a scope of work jointly developed by the town and SRPEDD. And as I said before, our focus really is on a number of interrelated goals, but sort of the hub of the wheel, if you will, is really thinking about open space protection and future development patterns, which are basically two sides of the same coin. Thinking about, what future land use is going to be like in Plympton and what the sort of attributes associated with that are. The slide that's up now has our project team. Obviously, you've got myself and Neil tonight. In future meetings, you're going to be hearing from Sarah Burns with the Nature Conservancy and her colleague, Maria Gabrielle. Danica Warnes is the Climate Resiliency Coordinator with Mass Audubon. Mass Audubon is going to be doing what's known as a bylaw review for the town as part of this project. And then certainly both Bill Napolitano and Helen Zinkevich are going to be faces that you'll see throughout. Unfortunately, they ended up getting double booked, so they're not here with us tonight. But my assumption is they'll be at all the meetings going forward. And then finally, Courtney Roja is the sort of Southeastern region coordinator for the state MVP program. So I'm sure she will have an active role in the project as well. Okay, in terms of project goals, I've already really started to speak to this, so I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. But this is really about taking locally identified goals and then using the wherewithal of the project team to try to move from that planning to implementation. So to that end, certainly creating an action plan for open space protection and associated natural resource management is an important piece of the puzzle. And then also some focus on refinement of planning documents and development controls to help implement that action plan. Manomet's role in the project is going to be providing some technical assistance in prioritizing open space protection and making some recommendations on associated management. We'll really start tonight to get into this notion of taking some of the regional analysis that our group's been involved in and helping you think through what that means at the local level. And then finally, we're going to be doing some pretty specific forest assessment and making some recommendations on forest management. And to that end, Neil and I have already spent some time on the ground in Plympton, and Neil's going to be doing some more site visits going forward. Okay, the Plimpton Goals, and this is a pretty broad range from a number of different planning documents, but certainly near the top of the list is securing a drinking water supply and protecting that the water quality associated with that supply. Now, obviously, that's only partially overlaps with the goals of this project, but certainly open space protection, if you're strategic about it, can do a good job of both preserving groundwater recharge and then also protecting the quality of that water. So there is a real significant overlap there. Protection of rural character. Plympton is experiencing a lot of development pressure. You're still in a situation where you've got really outstanding open space resources. And so, thinking carefully about how that development pressure plays out is going to be an important part of the project. Thinking about flood control. We're going to talk a little bit about climate change issues and associated increase in threat from freshwater flooding. Minimizing tax burden. On first blush, that may seem like a little bit of an outlier here, but there are a couple of aspects of it that are worth consideration. The first is that the open space that you've got right now supplies a lot of services, in particular flood control and water quality protection, at very little cost to the citizens. And so any change in that as future development occurs has the potential for creating a situation where you've then got to pay to try to replicate some of those services through engineered systems. So that's an important piece of the puzzle. The other part of it is that we're going to help you to better understand how you can actually leverage the development approval process to protect the open space that you want. Now, it's not that you're going to be able to get all the way down the road on that, but certainly it can help supplement the need for any tax dollars used to protect open space. And then finally, biodiversity protection. This has shown up as a high priority issue in a number of different planning efforts, and really is a key element in the work that Manomet's going to be involved in. Okay, so just a handful of slides on climate issues. I'll warn you, I'm going to need to go through this pretty rapidly, and this is a topic that you could easily spend an entire presentation on. So this is just going to be a very high level taste of this topic, but hopefully I can hit on a couple of key themes that are really going to be important in thinking about open space protection and resiliency in Plympton. So first up, I'm going to run an animation, and this is going to show you over 100 years of measured record of how global temperatures are changing. And basically the way this thing reads is that blue temperatures are below baseline, red temperatures are above. And so you can see over time how this progresses. So I'll just run it and then I'll offer a little bit more explanation. Whoop, that didn't work. Hang on just a second. There we go. Okay. I'll just let it run and then I'll offer some commentary. You can see the dates at the bottom of the screen incrementing. Okay, so that brings us all the way up to 2018. So you can see how things have changed relative to a mid-century average. And, you know, as we get towards the current time, you can see both that the rate of warming increases and that also the extremity of the warming, particularly at the poles, really picks up. So, you know, this is part of, you know, what we know is occurring through measured information. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the model projections going forward. All right, so this is another way of looking at how things have changed. This is over the last 30 years. The darkest reds show an increase in average annual temperature of 1.5 degrees. And for a lot of New England, we're sort of at the high end of that scale. In terms of projections going forward, we don't know exactly what greenhouse gas emissions rates are going to be. And so it's very common to look at different emission scenarios. On the left, you see RCP 4.5, which involves a fairly sharp drawdown in greenhouse gas emissions. And that keeps, by the end of this century, warming down more in the 4 to 6 degree range for our part of the world. You can see on the right what's known as a business as usual emission scenario, a continued increase. And in that situation, we get a much more sharp warming by the end of the century. Second variable I'm going to cover here is precipitation. So again, this is measured precipitation change over the last 30 years. The darkest green is roughly a 15% increase. And you can see again for Eastern Massachusetts, we're really at the high end of that scale. Now, this is projected information going forward. This is out to century's end under a higher emission scenario. The big changes are projected to be in winter and spring. And you can see sort of the red stipple over those areas that indicates a statistically significant increase. And so what we're projected to see is not only an increase in annual precipitation, but the bulk of that coming in winter and spring. For summer and fall, not so much change. a slight increase shown there, but very much closer to what it would be natural variation in the climate system. So we can start now to think about a couple of take-homes in terms of impacts. So with this continued increase in temperature and this increase in winter precipitation, it's very likely that now when we have wet periods, they're going to be wetter than they have been in the past. So that starts to set up some concerns with freshwater flooding. But then conversely, in the summer months and in the fall, with the warmer temperatures, longer growing season, et cetera, we've also got the potential for more impactful drought. So that has impacts for groundwater, for drinking water supply, impacts for surface water, et cetera, and also has natural system impact ramifications. And then in terms of changing precipitation extremes, the other thing that's really significant for our part of the world, New England, is that we've got a real strong biasing going on towards very heavy precipitation events. So not only are we getting more precipitation over time, but it's coming in heavy downpours increasingly, and that's projected, that trend is projected to continue going forward. So again, it underscores some of the concerns with freshwater flooding and associated non-point source water pollution. All right, so I've really started to speak to the ramifications. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead and cover the green infrastructure analysis and then pass it over to Neil for the forestry section. So when I say green infrastructure, this is really a regional approach to strategic conservation planning. And I'll read this definition for you because I think it really does a good job of providing an overview. So what we're talking about is a network of waterways, wetlands, woodlands, wildlife habitats, and other natural areas that support native species, maintain natural ecological processes, sustain air and water resources, and contribute to health and quality of life. So you may have heard this term used, EPA in particular uses the term green infrastructure to refer to site-specific stormwater management features. And that's fine, that can be folded into the definition, but we're really taking a regional perspective on these issues in this analysis. All right, so for those of you that aren't familiar, this is the outline of the Taunton Watershed. Plympton is over here in the extreme east of the watershed. And so as I step through this, you'll probably want to focus here. Now, after we do these regional maps, I'm going to zoom in on Plympton and show you some of that in detail. So this is one of the three main tributary watersheds to Narragansett Bay. It's roughly 550 square miles, so a very big piece of real estate. All right, this is the current land use land cover. One of the take homes here is that you've got a lot of green, meaning that this is an area, just as the case in Plympton, you've got a lot of areas that really have not been impacted really significantly by development yet. Now, certainly there's some exceptions, these brown areas, around Taunton and up near Brockton in the northern part of the watershed, but a lot of intact natural resource. Okay, so there are three main inputs to the analysis. The first is based on a resilient landscapes analysis by the Nature Conservancy. This analysis really asks the question of which areas are going to support high biodiversity as the climate warms and species assemblages shift on the landscape. The way the legend reads here is that the dark green areas have the highest projected habitat value going forward, the brown areas the lowest. And so for our purposes in the analysis, we took the highest two categories there and grouped those together. And then for each of these inputs, we backed out what we call the undeveloped, unprotected component of it. And so basically anything that's already been protected through previous conservation areas comes off the map here. And we're left with essentially what's in play from a conservation perspective. So that's the first input. Our second input is from Biomap 2, which is really about identifying important habitat areas under today's climate with a particular emphasis on rare, threatened, and endangered species. Now you can see there's a large hub over here that Plympton's part of, and this is really going to be a focal area for us in our work. So we're going to do the same thing here in terms of backing out the protected land. And one thing I'd like you to notice here, I'll go back, for a lot of the other important hubs here, there's already significant conservation work that's been done. But if you compare the area surrounding Plympton and just to the west, comparatively speaking, there's not been as much conservation work. So that's really going to be a focal area for us in this project. So it's our second input to the analysis. And then finally, to kind of bring in the notion of human community resiliency, we've got a layer that is focused on the stream systems, freshwater ponds, et cetera, the river systems in the watershed. That's all shown in the various shades of blue. That was buffered in the analysis. You can see the buffer in the green. Same logic, we backed out the protected areas. And so that becomes the third component. And so layering those together, we get our aggregate green infrastructure map for the region. Now, one of the powerful things we can do, this is all done in what's known as a geographic information system. It's all computer-based. So we can now run statistics on it. So for instance, the network in total covers 44% of the watershed. 66% of that is in the undeveloped, unprotected category. So depending on the nature and placement of future development, that's all vulnerable, if you will. And so that map shows you just the undeveloped, unprotected component. All right, so zooming into Plympton, so you can get a better look at that. It's this hub right here, the Winnetuxet River's over here, which is going to be a focal area for this work. Now you can see the watershed boundary does come across Plympton. So I'm going to switch and show you some of a more recent analysis that really zooms in and shows you Plympton in its entirety. So just to get oriented, it's a little hard to read, but we do have locality boundaries here. So basically I'm tracing the outline for Plympton, and I'm going to show you a few of the inputs as they apply to the whole locality. First up, this is the resiliency analysis from TNC that I showed you before, and this is what it looks like. So you've basically got two big clusters here, one down in the Winnetuxet and one in the eastern portion of the locality. This is the core habitat from Biomap, which I showed you before. And again, you've got sort of these two clusters that are important. This is looking at flood zones for the region. So again, as we start to think about this intersection between open space protection that could do double duty and do a good job of habitat protection, but also address some flooding concerns, we can start to think about how this layer interacts with the others. And then finally, when we connect it all together, you can see that for Plympton, a substantial portion of the land area is shown here, but our ability to back out and look at these other layers really gives us the ability, sort of, X-ray vision, if you will. And as we talk about different priorities, we'll be able to use that information to help really zero in on where the priority protection areas are for the locality. All right, and certainly wouldn't suggest to you that this is a silver bullet approach, but it's really an important piece of the puzzle in thinking about the future for Plympton. And hopefully by now this is starting to gel for you a little bit. But through strategic conservation planning, we've got the option or opportunity to better control flooding and non-point source water pollution, to maximize groundwater recharge, address multiple ecological stressors, the potential for reduction in infrastructure cost, and maintaining public access and recreational use. All right, so at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Neil, and he's going to walk you through some of our thoughts on the forestry work. So Neil?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So the forestry component of the project will focus on evaluating vulnerabilities of the vegetation to climate change. And the main steps in this process are listed here. First, we'll use site visits to document the current structure, composition, and health of the forest land in Plympton. We'll then use some desk-based research on the known vulnerabilities of individual species and of the community to climate change, and think about how these changes in the forest could then translate into changes in forest functions and the goods and services that you as residents value from your forests. And then finally, if we detect any particularly impactful areas in which climate change may impair forest functioning, we'll then consider some management options to address any of these concerns, whether that's active management or otherwise. If we could just move to the next slide, please. So the graphic here is just a very high-level overview of the vegetation and land cover types in Plympton, and I've done some aggregating here of different land cover types, which may be why the image might differ slightly from your local knowledge of the area. The main forest type we can see in this area is it's called Northern Atlantic Coastal Plain Hardwood Forest. So it's basically hardwoods dominated by various different types of oak species. And you can see that in light green on the map. In some areas, white pine is now a particularly important species within this forest group. It's not a hardwood, but as we'll see later and shortly later, white pine is encroaching on many of these oak forests. Other important forest types are dominated by red maple in low-lying swampy areas, and another swamp forest that's particularly important from an ecological perspective is Atlantic white cedar, which is very rare, regionally speaking, and not particularly common as a forest type the whole of the eastern US. So that's a particularly important forest type that's present within this local area. If we could move on to the next slide, please. I thought I'd provide an overview of a framework that's used for assessing vulnerability to climate change in general, but often in forests. And Eric has really walked through some of the potential changes in climate in this region. And these changes in climate will affect the realized environmental conditions that are felt by forests. And this is the potential impact box that you see here on screen. The second key component, if you could just move the slide on, please, Eric. Yeah, that's it. Second key component is adaptive capacity. And we're talking here about the capacity of individual species or communities to withstand changes in the environment. And at the species level, this is often looking at physiological capacities of oaks or pines, for example, to withstand changes in temperature or precipitation. And by combining this information on species-specific vulnerabilities with potential changes in climate that would result in those vulnerabilities being magnified, then we can understand the vulnerability to climate change. And at the species level, it's also important to note, although it's not shown on this diagram, that the vulnerability of a specific species will vary from site to site according to the other species that are present on that site and their relative vulnerabilities. So you could easily have a situation where maple, for example, would be extremely vulnerable on one site because other competitors are less vulnerable, whereas on another site, maple would be less vulnerable because other competitors were more vulnerable. So there's some important biological interactions that aren't shown on this diagram. If we could move to the next slide, please. So this is an example of one of the tools that we and other forest managers might use in thinking about the vulnerability of individual species. And this is called what's part of the US Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas, which we're very lucky to have in the eastern part of North America. In the West, they don't have this setup. But the atlas provides information on a whole range of different variables related to each species and projects forward under different climate scenarios where that species' ideal habitat might be located and changes in dispersal ability of that species through time. What we see on screen here is an example from their ModFacts section, which is really a description of modifying factors related to a species' adaptive capacity. And those modifying factors influence how the species will respond to changes in the environment. It looks rather complex, but it's actually quite intuitive once you get the hang of it. The species that we're looking at here, as you can probably see, is scarlet oak. And each one of these boxes represents a biological trait of scarlet oak in relation to changes in the environment and disturbance regimes. And the cluster of trait boxes on the left is traits related to changes in the environment and also reproductive capacity. And the cluster on the right is tolerances of disturbance of various nature. And green indicates good, essentially. It's high adaptive capacity, whereas reds and oranges indicate low adaptive capacity. And you can see that oak, in general, most oak species are actually very tolerant of high temperatures and also of lower precipitation. And both of those things are forecast for this area of the world in the future, particularly during the summer months, not so much during the winter, obviously. But on the negative side of the equation, if you could just flip the slide forward, please, Eric. Yeah, on the negative side of the equation, you can see here that scarlet oak is particularly vulnerable to insects and also to diseases. And this is something we can see playing out in the forests around us. If you can move to the next slide, please, Eric. So these species pictures are actually taken from forests in my local area of Rhode Island, but they are of scarlet and red oak. And you can see some fairly high levels of overstory mortality here. And these stem from outbreaks of several defoliating insects, gypsy moth and forest tent caterpillar, that appeared in 2015, 2016. If you could just move on the slide, please, Eric. Thank you. This is a remote sensing derived image, which essentially shows changes in canopy greenness or leafiness in relation to the background average canopy greenness for this particular time of the year. And this was taken from the worst point, or one of the worst points, in the 2016 outbreak of gypsy moth. And you can see that Rhode Island was really taking a big hit. The oak dominated forests were really suffering from defoliation. And these defoliating insects in a single season wouldn't necessarily cause mortality, but over several seasons, then you can imagine that if your tree doesn't have any leaves for several seasons, it's not pulling in any sunlight, it's not doing any photosynthesis, and not generating any of the carbohydrate reserves it needs to survive. So over time, these defoliation events can add up, particularly once you layer in other stresses. Then you get that weaken the tree's defenses, then you can have mortality events. If you could just flip the slide forward, please. So in 2005 and 6, there were particularly severe defoliation events, again caused by gypsy moth and tent caterpillar, that hit the oaks in and around Plympton fairly badly. And many of you will probably have seen evidence of this in the woods. We certainly did when we went out to visit the site last October. So really, there are some important climate-related disturbance events that are affecting the forests around us. If you can move to the next slide, please. These pictures are taken from our visit to part of Plympton back end of October, I believe. And you can see another change that's underway, which is that white pine is gradually encroaching on previously oak-dominated forests. And in some cases, these forests are now mixed or even white pine dominated in the overstory in some areas. And these pictures are probably familiar to you from when you've been out walking around the local area. And the immediate cause of this change in species composition is fairly obvious. It's that white pine is regenerating like crazy in the understory, and oak species are not. And when you couple that with overstory mortality, then you're getting a change in composition. And some of these types of changes would occur naturally over what we call the process of succession, which is basically the changes in the environment that occur as a stand ages. You'd normally see changes in composition, but the changes that we're seeing here are not just being driven by succession. They're being influenced by land use patterns, like weather allowing fire to move through the landscape as it previously would have done. And they're also being caused by outbreaks of diseases. And oak in particular there's been a notable diminishment in regeneration potential of oaks right throughout Western or Eastern North America. And there's some talk of a general oak mortality complex, which is a confluence of different factors leading to oak dieback. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So just to bring it back to why, as residents of Plympton, you should care about or might want to care about these changes in forest health and structure and composition. Well, immediately, changes in composition can have a major effect on biodiversity, and not just of biodiversity of trees, but also of herbaceous plants and of aquatic species or birds, things that Biomap highlights as being particularly important in Plympton. Secondly, forests are major players in filtering water quality and attenuating floodwaters. And Eric alluded to potential flooding issues as a result of increased precipitation intensity in the future. So forests and forest structure are relevant there. Then obviously recreational benefits, and I know that that's important in Plympton. And there are several areas where changes in composition might well influence how much you enjoy recreating in the forest. And then I guess whether or not you are immediately concerned about regional forest carbon balance, you should be, because this significantly influences emissions in the atmosphere, whether the forests are net sinks of carbon dioxide or net sources of carbon dioxide. And that's something that we should all be very concerned about at the moment. Eric, I think I should pass it back to you at the end now.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. Okay, to wrap up our presentation, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about next steps in this process. So as Linda mentioned at the beginning, we've got an upcoming series of public meetings. This is the first, and they'll be hosted by our various project partners, as I indicated at the beginning. So hopefully, appreciate you guys turning out tonight, and hopefully you'll be able to check back in. As now, we don't have an exact schedule. I was hoping I could put that up for you this evening, but stay tuned. I'm going to show you our project website, and that's being hosted by SRPEDD. And as these follow-on meetings get scheduled, they'll get posted up there, and there'll also be public announcement, newspaper, etc. So in terms of the work that Neil and I are going to be involved in, we've got a good foundation of information as we've showed you tonight. We're going to be taking that and really starting to think through and work with a lot of local stakeholders on this question of prioritization. So, sort of given all of the information that we've got available to us, thinking about how that intersects with the local goals, and then what type of priorities come out of that. And then all of that will be rolled into development of a set of recommendations for open space protection. We hope to have a real sharply defined action plan there, if you will. Some thoughts about natural resource management along with that. I mean, as Neil has indicated, we're in a very dynamic time period with climate, and so management is really an important piece of the puzzle. And then putting that together with some recommendations on development controls going forward, so that you get the sort of attributes in Plympton that the citizens want. This is the link to the project page. I apologize, it is an unwieldy URL, but if you simply Google SRPEDD, which is the Southeast Region Planning and Economic Development District, you'll be able to pretty easily navigate to this project page from there. Our two primary contacts at SRPEDD are Bill Napolitano and Helen Sienkiewicz, their contact information here. And then finally, I'd like to acknowledge that the funding for this work comes from a mix of the Taunton River Stewardship Council and the Massachusetts MVP program. So thank you very much to the funders there. So with that, we're going to go to the chat, and hopefully we've got some questions to talk through. So
questions, anyone out there?
got nothing in the chat so far, so we've got an opportunity for Q&A live then.
I have one question on Eric's. At the very beginning of his presentation, he showed the world and the Arctic was totally red. Why is that the case and the Antarctic isn't?
Yeah, you've got a feedback loop, if you will, and what's been going on is we've been losing a lot of the sea ice in that part of the world, so that changes what's known as albedo or reflectiveness, and so you were toggling increasingly from having extensive ice cover, which is white and therefore very reflective, to having more open seawater in the northern extremity there. And so that creates a feedback loop where things are warming much more rapidly. And I mean, some of those changes are underway in the south, but not nearly to the same extent.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question about this white pine encroaching on oak forests and what the ecologic implications of that are.
One immediate ecological implication is that oaks as a genus are extremely have extremely rich insect biodiversity. So they support a very high number of insect species, which has implications for birds and cascades down through the food web. So that's an immediate implication. Also, the leaves of oak and most hardwood species, they break down in a very different way than do pine. Pine needles and other conifers are fairly resistant to decay, and the compounds that you get when those needles decay are very different to what you would receive during the decay of oak leaves. So that influences things like the inputs of nutrients to streams, which then has cascading impacts on stream food webs. So there's a whole variety of different implications. And then from a structural perspective, you can see that changes in the canopy will occur, which will influence, say, sunlight hitting the forest floor. And then changes in, if you have a change from a predominantly oak-dominated forest to a white pine-dominated forest, you'd normally also see some change in the level of carbon storage in that ecosystem as well. Oak-dominated forests tend to be toward the higher end of regional carbon storage.
As a follow-up to that, either Neil or Eric, a large number of our farmers in Plympton are cranberry farmers, and obviously pollination of the cranberry plants is extremely important. You can import bees and boost the pollination a little bit, but as forests changed from oak and broadleaf dominated to conifers, I assume the potential for natural native species of pollinators would also decline. Would that be a fair assumption?
It would be in a transition from oak to pine. And I think it's another interesting feature that research is beginning to reveal is how actually when land cover changes, so when you have a clear cut, for example, that removes trees and you just leave it as a fallow field, or you harvest the wood, then you eventually let it regrow as forest, that actually tends to increase pollinator availability because, as you know, Trevor, bees are very common in these flower-rich early cereal environments. So there are some really slightly strange countervailing effects of management impacts on forest cover.
Yeah. To follow up on that, I was wondering, so are you implying that management by removing some of the white pine in some areas selectively, whether that be near streams or whatever the strategy would be, would that be a way to possibly stabilize the oaks, or is that sort of like sticking your finger in the dike and it's hopeless?
No, it's not. And what we call crown release which is a type of selective harvest where you would just release trees or remove trees from the edge of a vigorously growing oak could be a solution. And then also if you do a selective harvest that's of sufficient size, you could do something called a group selection cut, which is where you take out a chunk of trees. It's not a clear cut, but it's a small opening in the forest. That's particularly useful for some of the oak species, because species like scarlet oak really have quite a high intolerance of shade, whereas white pine can tolerate more shade. So for the red oak group, a group selection tree might be something that we'd consider at some point.
I have another follow-up, but I don't mean to pig it. So in terms of groundwater protection, whether it be in quality or quantity or whatever, does it make much difference? Is one tree as good as another as long as you're stabilizing the soil, or does it make a difference which of these species would be, preferable in terms of maintaining quality and quantity of water or stream flow or erosion control or whatever?
Do you want me to take a shot, Neil, or you want to?
If you come in, yeah, you come in, and then I'll follow up if there's anything.
Yeah, I think come at it in a couple of different ways, maybe. If you're thinking in terms of both groundwater recharge and water quality protection, if you're able to do a good job of protecting open space, sort of regardless of what the vegetation type is, as compared to development with associated impervious surface, that's really the big kind of on-off switch, if you will. Certainly, I guess from there, I would go to the notion of sort of the vitality of the vegetation and the complexity of it. And so if you've got a situation where you've got, a vibrant understory, you've got good age class diversity so that you've got a lot of varied structure, all that's going to go towards sort of maximizing the potential in terms of minimizing non-point source pollution. Now, one area where you may start to get a little bit of tension is that growing seasons are getting longer as the climate warms, and so we're going to get the possibility of situations during the summer and fall where that combination of high temperature, high evaporation rates, that longer growing season, et cetera, could all combine to stress water resources to some extent. So it's not totally a free lunch, but in general, I would argue in favor of just trying to encourage a real diverse forest in those open space areas. So Neil, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that's all of that is certainly true, and I'd add that in the types of transitions that we've talked about so far, that like white pine encroaching on oak, then I don't see any real impacts in terms of erosive ability, because both of those species have fairly deep root systems. But you could certainly get a situation where if you transition from a deep rooting species like oak to a very shallow rooting species that had less tree cover, then you could get increased surface erosion depending on interception of rainfall and depending on wind firmness and soil stabilization.
Can you speak to what's happening with we have extensive stands of beech and hemlock in this town. A lot of people don't know it because you have to go out into the swamps to see it, but there's some magnificent examples of beech and hemlock. And I can see it on my own property that the beeches are starting to die. And it really kind of shocked me. I lost a beech a couple of years ago that was easily 50 or 60 years old.
Right.
And it got that bark disease that I read about.
Yeah, well, that I think there's your answer really, is that beech bark disease is threatening beaches across the Northeast and into the Lake States. I don't actually know quite its progress into Plympton, but I will look at maps and things, but that is the immediate answer.
Is that climate related?
It's caused by a combination of insect and fungal pathogen. I believe climate is likely to exacerbate it because of changes in temperature and moisture regime, but it's one of those situations, a bit like Hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a real threat to eastern hemlock. It's one of those situations where, to a certain extent, it's just baked into the system, and even if climate change weren't happening, it would still be spreading, which is really unfortunate. Until we develop some sort of solution to it, and I'm not aware of any to beech bark disease, then it's just, you just have to manage the decline, unfortunately.
Okay.
Well, any other questions?
Well, I'll go in one more time, and then don't mean to keep us, but when you help us look at, options as we learn in the next couple of months and put all these factors together, you said you can look at tree composition, right? From GIS or something, you can tell which are pine and which are in transition and that kind of stuff. And eventually, would we be wanting to lay that out in terms of parcel size, if you will? In other words, you talk about corridors or networks at some point. It might be strategic to figure out where the best connections are and what makes those the best connections versus some other configuration. Is that sort of in the crystal ball as we go along here, that when we think about, we can't save everything, so how do we make decisions on which ones are going to be the most beneficial?
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts, and again, I'll kick it over to Neil, but I think it's going to be really important to think about regional context as we step into this. And that's why I wanted to start off by showing that analysis for the whole Taunton Watershed, because, the Winnetuxet corridor is certainly going to be really important in these discussions, and thinking about how the surrounding localities might play a part in a regional approach to thinking about conservation could really, I think, up the value of the efforts for all of the adjacent localities. I'm a real fan of thinking about stream systems, riparian corridors, if you will, because you get so many attributes that get layered up if you can protect those areas. You get the connectivity that you're speaking about. You get a great opportunity to help protect water quality. Oftentimes, those are areas that are sort of high hazard, if you will, from a flooding perspective. And so the extent to which you can protect those from development, you create sort of a virtuous circle for the locality, and that you're not allowing a situation to evolve where then the taxpayers are on the hook for dealing with some difficult to resolve flooding issues going forward. So, a lot of different factors play into it. But, like I said, I'm a real fan of looking at the river systems and the streams, or the capillary network that connects it together, is one way to think about organizing the open space protection efforts. So Neil?
Yeah, completely agree. I think it's this looking at regional scale is important, because you may observe things which are you don't think are particularly important in your local area, but then if you look to a larger scale, you'll see that they are actually quite regionally valuable. And then the other thing you might want to think about, it's slightly hard, maybe may come across as hard-headed, but if there are certain things which are certain species, for example, or areas of land which are not likely to fare particularly well, irrespective of whether you protect them, then there is a certain logic in thinking, okay, well, let's turn our attention to other areas. But that's sort of like a worst case scenario for the future, and something that I don't think we need to consider at the moment.
Okay, there's a lot to think about. Could you, either one of you, enumerate what the topics are of some of the other upcoming workshops? I think Bill was mentioning today that he thought next workshop might be on soils.
Yeah,
So-
if that's the case, it's probably going to be Bill and Helen leading that one. They've been involved in some regional efforts to think about a number of different, just as we're talking about kind of stacking of attributes in open space protection. They've been thinking about sort of stacking of attributes on some soils issues, thinking about soil carbon, groundwater recharge, et cetera. So I assume if they're, if he's talking about that next, it's probably going to be the Bill and Helen show. At some point, TNC will be in to talk about some of the analytic tools they've got, and you're going to see some interesting interconnection with the work that Neil and I presented tonight and the tools that TNC's got. From Mass Audubon, they have a program that's really focused on sort of protection of rural character through the lens of development controls, your zoning, your subdivision ordinance, et cetera, et cetera. So at some point, I think the folks from Mass Audubon will be in to talk about how you can implement a lot of the ideas that we're talking about from a conservation perspective, through some adjustment in your development controls. So.
Great. Well, for those, oh, go ahead.
Oh, just one other thought, and I'm sure that at some point we're going to have more of a roll up your sleeves meeting or two or three, where once we've kind of been through those different topic areas, then it's going to be time to really try to figure out how we knit all these different priorities together. Because you're right, it's not easy initially to see how you can do the prioritization that we're tasked with doing, but it certainly, we've got a good team and a great base of information for that. So.
Yeah. Well, as a small town, you all are bringing us a capacity we never ever would have, and we've known, because it does have such high ratings in biomap, we're the top, this general area of the Winnetuxet and going over into the, Halifax, Middleborough. It's in the top 3 most important areas in Southeast Mass, the top 20% for the state. So we know we have important ecological qualities here, but, without your help and guidance, trying to figure out how do you make strategic decisions and maybe weave some bylaw changes and other opportunities into that to figure out how we make the most of what we have, because we also aren't a town with any money. So we have to do it on a very practical level and then look for grants and other awards as they could come along. So it's a great package to have all of you coming in and helping us begin to understand this and think it through.
Yeah, I think the timing's good because, as you know, development pressure is ramping up, but you're still in a situation where, if you can get the development controls tweaked in a way that protect the attributes that are really important to the citizens there, you've got time on the clock to get that done. So, yeah.
It's very exciting. So for those of you who are listening, if you either, I think there's a chat room going right now, or you can come on to Plympton's webpage, our homepage, and go to the Open Space Committee. And we have a form there that you can, it's just an easy form to fill out if you want to have us giving you information about the project as we go along. And that'll include announcements of the next workshops, but anything that comes out in between. So if you're interested in that, either fill it out if the chat room has something up right now, or just go to the open space page and we'll do that. And on the open space page, we're also putting a direct link to SRPEDD's Winnetuxet Plympton page. So I wrote it down because there are a couple of, because there is something, if you go into your search engine, you can just type in SRPEDD Plympton and you'll go to the page that's all about us. Or you can go to the Winnetuxet Watershed Resilience, if you want those big words, or you can go to Open Space Plan. The Open Space Committee page, Open Space Committee, and we'll have a link there. So just go to the Open Space Committee in Plympton, hit the link, and you will be on the Plimpton, because this SRPEDD has put up a whole Plimpton Winnetuxet page now for everything about this project. And hopefully this tonight was recorded. The first introduction to the project was recorded. All these other things are going to be, and they're putting other resources and maps and things up there that you can look at more slowly and play with them and submit questions along the way and all that. So we really want people to be involved as this goes along. So please take advantage of this fantastic platform they're giving us to, really absorb it between meetings so we can all start talking in a couple of months and figure out what we want to do.
Great. Well, with that, I think we've used up our time. So thank you so much for joining. Appreciate you taking part and look forward to interacting with you in the future on this.
Well, Eric and Neil, thank you very, very much. You give us a lot to think about, but we're glad you're not going anywhere. So
Thank you for having us.
we'll see you around.
Okay. All right. Have a good evening, everybody.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. There's Juliana. Thank you, Juliana.
I think it went great.
It did. It was really good and a lot to think about, but it's, it's going to be an exciting project. So thank you for coming in and helping us maneuver all this. I think your mic's not on, or maybe I'm not.
How about now?
It's good.
I was just saying, I'm already looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, no, it's good. And Bill mentioned someone on soil, so was going to be doing it with them. And I didn't get that name, but we'll go ahead and post the, I'm supposed to talk to him tomorrow, and then we'll put up the next agenda, so, but thank you a lot. So everyone's off now. And if